Yeah, John and I'll take you through in about hopefully 25, 30 minutes the main findings from the research that we've carried out this year. And we'll take questions at the end. As Lisa said, if there's questions during it, please pop them in the chat and we'll try and address them at the end of the presentation. We've got plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end of the presentation. Just to give you a bit of an overview in terms of what we were commissioned to do for the range of partners that Lisa mentioned. The aim of the research was to understand current and potential pricing strategies, pricing models, pricing benchmarks, and their impact on museum audiences, and also to look at how museums can adapt their admissions charging to respond to the current environment and also be, as best we can, prepared for what might happen in the future. There were four main strands to the research. I won't dwell too much on the method, but I want to reassure you about the depth and quality of the responses that we got for the primary research in particular. The range of desk-based research analysis tasks we carried out, but two of the key strands was a survey of museums, which took place primarily in March of this year. So for anybody that's on the call that responded to the survey, thank you very much for taking the time to do so. We got 344 valid usable replies by the end of the survey, which gives a really good cross-section of museums across the UK, primarily Scotland, England and Wales. Some responses in Northern Ireland, but a little light on that, as will become clear on the benchmark data later on. But a very good response, which gives a good mix of geography, type and size of museum that fed into that. We also did a range of one-to-one discussions, museum consultations. We did 29 of them. They were drawn from the survey, from discussions with the steering group for the research, and also from what we were aware of. And that focused on museums that had changed their pricing in some way, either in terms of either a fundamental shift or a nuanced shift in recent times. So we wanted to understand from those consultations in particular, some of the changes and the impact of changes around pricing that had happened in recent times. And those consultations fed into the range of case studies and vignettes that you'll find in the main report and the success guide that have been produced on the back of the research. In terms of some headlines from the survey, just to emphasise, I guess, what those headlines are and where they sit more generally, the survey results showed that just over half, 51% of respondents charge for general admissions to the museum. One third, 36%, more than one third, don't charge at all for either general admissions or specific exhibitions. Compared to other sources of evidence, that might appear slightly higher, although it does align with the annual museum survey results, but slightly higher than recent results, both in Scotland for MGS and in Wales on the Spotlight for Welsh Government, slightly higher. And I think that reflects the fact that AIM membership in particular were very keen and did respond very well to the survey. But generally, we've got a good cross-section that's representative of the sector. In terms of that charging position, this research that we carried out this year was almost an update on work that John and I carried out back in 2016 for AIM and other partners. And we can compare those findings, the 2023 results, to the previous research. And that shows that a higher proportion of museums now report charging for general admissions. So that has gone up from 42% in 2016 up to 51% this year. And there's been a decrease both in those that don't charge at all and also those that charge for both general admissions and specific exhibitions. So overall, we're at a position this year where 64% charge in some way for admissions, 36% don't, and it was 43% that didn't in 2016. Beyond those general headlines around charging, we've also looked at charging, and the report dwells on this in a range of different ways and looks in it a bit more detail, but I'll give you some examples of that. By different characteristics of museums, the chart, as you look at the screen on the left, is about charging position relative to museum type. And what you'll see is on the far right, the overall is that overall position. The light green at the top is the proportion that don't charge, and you'll see therefore some obvious examples. Nationals don't charge for general admissions, but do charge for specific or temporary exhibitions. University museums don't charge at all. The one that stands out, I guess, relative to some of those averages, there's various nuances, is that local authority museums, so it's still in local authority now, we've got a separate bar for ex-local authority museums. Local authority museums are more likely not to charge for admissions compared to others, as you can see from that larger green bar on that second in column. We also looked at it by the core funding position. of respondents. And again, we've got the overall responses on that right-hand bar on the right-hand chart. And what we can see there, not surprisingly, is that for museums that report that the vast majority of their income comes from one or two core funders, so we're talking more than 3/4 of their income, they are less likely to charge. Those that don't have any core funders are about average, around about 36%, don't charge. The rest in the middle, those that have got some core funding that accounts for up to a quarter or up to 3/4 of their funding, are more likely to charge, which we think suggests that they've got quite a diverse, or are aiming for a diverse income, in as much as they charge, but they also have core funding and other aspects in the mix. So the one that we notice there is both those that rely very much on core funding are less likely to charge, but also those that have got no core funding are also about average in terms of their charging position. In terms of charging by other characteristics, we asked in the survey different aspects about the local context of the museum, and I think this is a key aspect of the findings from the research, and John will come back and revisit this later on. But in terms of some of those characteristics, we asked about the level of competition locally for visitors. We asked about how significant the visitor economy is to the local area and how important the museum itself is to that local visitor economy. So this is in terms of the charging position. Does the museum charge or not charge for admissions? In terms of the price for those that charge, I'll come back and visit that later on. There's a limited relationship between charging or not charging relative to the level of competition for attracting visitors in the local area. There wasn't a strong correlation in the results from that. There's a clearer link between how significant the visitor economy is to the local area and whether or not the museum charges or not. If the visitor economy is not at all significant, 13% of the museums that replied to the survey charge for admissions. That's compared to that 64% average. Where the visitor economy is a key sector, 73% of museums in that type of area charge. And even if the visitor economy is one of a number of significant sectors, it's still at the same level at 72% charging for admissions compared to that overall average of 64%. What also emerges, which is in the chart on this slide as well, is not surprisingly the very clear relationship that emerges when charges considered relative to how important the museum feels it is to the local visitor economy. The more important it is, the higher the chance that the museum charges. So some important characteristics there about charging or not relative to those characteristics. I'll revisit how much in terms of price museums might charge on those same characteristics later on. We also asked about changes to the charging position in terms of when the changes took place and also the type of change. I'll come on to the type in a second. In terms of changes and how often museums have made changes, we asked, and about half, or almost half, 49%, said that they hadn't made a change. Now, what we asked about was a change pre-pandemic, 2018, 2019, for either general or specific admissions. Same for the pandemic years, 2020 and 21, and also for last year, 2022. So about half say they didn't make any change in that period, and we'll come back to that cohort shortly. The rest typically made changes around general admissions more than specific exhibitions, and especially last year, 2022. In terms of the type of change, the most common was introducing an increase in admission prices. We asked about change in price up or down, new types of ticket, and also some of the more fundamental changes moving from free to charging or charging to free. Increase in price was the most common. 70% said that. You'll note from the percentages that are on this slide, they add up to more than 100 because people have done more than one thing in terms of increasing price, introducing new tickets, or making a more fundamental change. But the most common was an increase in price. 70% that replied to this question reported that, followed by introducing a new type or types of ticket. 30% did that. And in terms of those more fundamental changes, 18% said they'd moved from charging to free over that period, and 11% had moved from free to charging. And as I said, introducing a decrease in admission prices was the least common. 5% reported that they'd done that at some point in those years. In terms of some more broader changes, we also asked more up-to-date figures in terms of plans to change this year. But interestingly, some trends that emerged of those that reported that they hadn't made a change. So those that said they didn't do any of those above changes in those time periods, Around two-thirds said that they hadn't thought about it. So not only did they not make a change, they hadn't considered making a change over that period, suggesting for some that their pricing position, whatever that may be, is fairly fixed. Interestingly, those that don't charge for admissions are more likely not to have considered making a change. So if you take that, 64% said they hadn't considered making a change. If you don't charge for admissions, 76% said that they hadn't considered making a change, compared to 47% of those that charge. So showing a difference in approach for those that charge and those that don't charge. This is the survey was carried out around about March time this year. At that point, more than three-quarters said they were not planning to make any further changes to their admissions charge position during this year, during 2023. Once again, those that don't charge for admissions are more likely not to report that we're planning to make that change. 94% of them said they weren't planning it, compared to 65% of those that charge, with the average sitting in the middle at 76%. We also asked about a range of other considerations around charging and different pricing strategies that have been talked about and considered to varying degrees, I think. One of which was around dynamic pricing, which has been mentioned quite recently. Interestingly, only 2% of those that replied to the survey reported having used or implemented a dynamic pricing strategy for admissions to the museum, but about 1/5 have considered it, and by default, the vast majority have neither used nor considered it so far. It's slightly more popular was 1 in 10 almost have used either a pay what you can, pay what you will, pay what you think type of pricing strategy, and again, a further 1/5 have considered it. But again, a majority, more than 70%, have neither used nor considered a pay what you think, pay what you will type strategy so far. 8% reported they've used some kind of charging policy or pricing for online access or virtual access to their collections, again with a further 1/5 having considered it. More common, perhaps not surprisingly, is that a far higher proportion of museums have implemented or considered charging around school visits. More than half have done so, 51% said so, 13% have considered it, which still remains over a third have neither used nor considered a charging pricing model for schools. And beyond those main strategies, other specific pricing models were also mentioned by respondents. Different aspects, about a fifth mentioned them. The most was particular strategies around group visits was the most common around that, as well as some other bespoke options. Some other aspects which is worth reflecting on, I think. We also asked about museums and whether or not they collected information about the demography and diversity of their visitors. And two-thirds, 67% respondents reported that they don't collect information like that from the visitors. And again, we looked at that relative to the charging position. Those that do charge are more likely to report collecting some of that information, 38% compared to 23% that don't charge. So again, a slight variance in that position, but it still shows that whether you charge or not, most museums in the survey reported that they don't collect information about the demography and diversity of their visitors. We also asked about gift aid, and if we exclude those that reported gift aid was not applicable to them, 38% report that they don't claim gift aid, 34% say they use the annual pass scheme, and 28% report using the additional 10% scheme. One of the key aspects of the survey was about charging benchmarks, how much the museums charge for admissions. The results report focus on general admissions rather than temporary exhibitions, and the data I'm going to present just now covers both, and so does the report, both the mean and median benchmarks, but we're going to focus on the median benchmarks, but they help in terms of using medians rather than means. It's an important aspect in terms of helping the results address any strong outliers you might find at either end of the charging position. So the median benchmarks are a more appropriate benchmark to use. In terms of ticket types, there's a whole host of ticket types, as we're all very aware, but what we're focused on in the results here and in the report, although the report gives a bit more detail on some of the other types, are the key ticket types of adult, concession, child, and family. And on child, we've split it into older and younger without specifying an age range. What we did notice in terms of the results is that there is usually a split between the admission price for an older child and a younger child. The exact age at which that might happen varies across the sector, but it's worth reporting both types. and that's the results that we get for overall responses to the survey. So the median adult admission is £7.60. The median concessions of pound less, £6.60. The median for an older child is £3. The median for a younger is free access, £0. And the median for a family is 24. The report looks at this in various different ways. I'll highlight some headlines in a second, but that gives us the range of results. And the report and this table shows both the mean as well as the median, and also the range, the lowest and the highest values that we got in the responses to the survey. Looking at those results geographically, again, using median results, what this chart shows is that the median for those that replied from museums in Scotland was £8, as it was in England, and it was £6.50 in Wales. There were no insufficient number of replies from Northern Ireland for us to give any benchmarks on results from there. But if we drill down geographically and look at England, the median again in the north, £7, in the Midlands, £8.80, and across the south, it's £8. But drilling down again, if we look at across the south, we find that the median for London is £10, for the southeast is £8, and for the southwest is £5. Now, they're still very high geographic areas, but what that emphasises, I think, are the variances you can see in benchmarks around pricing for admissions income across those geographies. John will revisit the importance of getting benchmarking right later on in the presentation. We also looked at it by other characteristics, one of which was by museum type. Now, you remember earlier on that we noted that the propensity to charge or not charge did vary a little by museum type. But if you look at the median results here, what it tends to show, look at that adult price, it's very, very similar for independent museums or all other types of museum. We've grouped it in that way because of response levels. What that seems to suggest, you can see the same to varying extents throughout the rest of the results in this table, is that the decision to charge or not might vary by type, but once you decide to charge, how much you charge doesn't vary that much by type of museum. Not as much, certainly, as the idea of charging or not charging. And in terms of those other characteristics that I mentioned earlier on, we looked at the admissions benchmarks by those same characteristics. So that's about the level of competition for attracting local visitors and how important the museum is to the local economy as well. Results that the chart on this slide show that the prices are typically lower in areas where it's not at all competitive to attract visitors, which suggests that those that do face competition, be it moderate or very competitive areas, are not competing on price because their prices are typically higher than areas that report it's not at all competitive. So overall, what that's suggesting to us is that once you decide to charge, museums are not involved in a competition on price and going for lower prices to try and attract visitors. Different factors and characteristics are coming into play. Unsurprisingly, the more significant the museum is to the local area in terms of attracting visitors, the higher the admission prices, both mean and median. As this slide, I won't dwell on it, shows you what you've got is the mean and the median prices here. The upper charts include the family ticket. The lower charts take the family ticket out just to make it clearer what you see there, which is that the more important a museum is, the higher the median or the mean price is for those museums and for those that charge. I mentioned earlier on about the changing in charging and what would the most common strategies have been in recent years, the most common of which has been an increase in price, followed by new types of admission ticket, then from charging to free and free to charging. And we looked in detail at each of these, and the report looks at these in terms of the survey results, but also gives you some examples, named examples of museums, case study museums that we visited, in terms of the impact that these different strategies have had on the museums. You'll be relieved to know I'm not going to dwell on this table, this slide, which has got a lot of information on it. I'll give you the summary headlines in a second. But the report looks at this in more detail. And what we looked at for each of those changes, be it increase in price, new type of ticket, charging to free or free to charging, was the impact that had in a variety of ways, including number of visitor, demography and diversity of visitor, admissions income, other income, donations, dwell time, and relationships with the local community, stakeholders and funders, friends and members. In terms of the headlines, what it shows here, not surprisingly, on some of these, for introducing an increased admission price, the most positive impact is on admissions income. So if the price goes up, admissions income tends to go up, which shows as well what we would call that admissions pricing for museums is typically price inelastic. In other words, if you put the price up, you will get more income. You don't see such a drop off in visitors that you find that you're no better off in terms of income. It's price inelastic. So slightly higher prices will typically increase admissions income. Most other aspects for increase in price, no change was the most prevalent response, with the next most positives being around number of visitors and secondary on-site spend. The previous 2016 research looked at this in more detail, but on secondary on-site spend, putting prices up does not mean that visitors will spend less on other aspects of secondary spend. There's not a correlation between the two. So the other aspects that were positive were number of visitors and secondary on-site spend for increases in admission price. For those that introduced new types of different tickets, the most positive aspect again was on admissions income. The next most positive was around the number of visitors and the demography and diversity of visitors. So museums reported they felt they got more visitors when they changed their admissions ticket types, and also a better mix of visitor as well. And again, most other impacts, no change was the most prevalent response. Bottom half of the slide, in terms of the most fundamental changes, for those that went from charging to free, perhaps unsurprisingly, again, the most positive impact was on the number of visitors that they received, followed by the demography and diversity of visitors, and then by the on-site donations. Going free obviously changes the potential for donations, but John will come back and revisit some of the important strategic plans around that if you're thinking about doing that later on. Next most positive is around secondary spend and also relationships with the local community of going from charging to free. Not surprisingly, the most negative was around admissions income. For those who go from free to charging, admissions income was the most positive impact. Beyond that, the most common reported response was no change. Some do report negative aspects around visit numbers and on-site donations, but others are less likely to report that and say they didn't see that negative impact. So that gives you some headlines about some of those high-level impacts. I'm going to pass on to John now to talk you through some of the patterns, the innovations, the good practice that emerged from the research, and what's some of the headlines that are in the success guide that's been produced alongside the main research report. John.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for your interest in the work. I'm going to sort of dwell on some of the sort of so what issues that come out of the survey and the case studies, and this quite a lot of this is all of this is in the main research report, which I'm sure you'll all have read from front to cover. But quite a lot of it is actually in the success guide, which is a really pragmatic and useful way of museums and people working with museums to pick out the most sort of practically relevant conclusions and work with them. In terms of patterns around admission charging, I think the first point to make is that there's a real sense of, or a real mix of confidence, of vibrancy around charging, and reticence and nervousness, and that's across different roles and responsibilities in museums, from people that are trustees to senior leadership to staff to volunteers. It really is a mix. Museums were consulted with reported very little audience negativity over increases in charging. Little evidence, Stephen said, of price elasticity. So if the price goes up, there's no great change in audience numbers, which is really, really interesting. We're finding that secondary spend is not affected by these changes in price. And I've got a little theory about there being two brains when it comes to visitors. It's like my son's idea of two stomachs. You've got a main dinner stomach and then you've got a pudding stomach. And what happens there really is that the decision to visit is made, and then once that decision is made, it's locked down. And it's quite often made ahead of the day of the visit. And when the day of the visit happens, folks have I wouldn't say that they've necessarily forgotten the admission price, but they've come with a sense of what we're going to do these things, we're going to spend this money, and one doesn't seem to affect the other. There's some layering of extras along with a rise in price. So some consulting museums saying, okay, we've put our price up, but the audio guide is now free. That kind of thing. So there's I wouldn't say it's mitigation, but it's very interesting to see consulting museums explain that they're really highlighting what people get for extra for that increase in price. Free to charging, obviously it reduces visitor numbers. as you would expect. The nature in which visitor numbers are calculated often changes, but we're not finding, we certainly on this study, any example of mass outcry as a result from going from free to charging. But the approach to charging taken in museums is dependent on values and founding principles of that museum, but quite often as well on confidence. It's linked to that issue of reticence and nervousness, the first point on that slide. Thanks, Stephen. Dynamic pricing, or as one museum called it, fixed variable pricing, is being considered by, and Stephen said only a very small proportion of the survey actually said they were using it at this stage, but it's beginning to be thought of to perhaps manage peaks. So discounting price when there's a quieter period to manage capacity, or perhaps make special exhibitions more accessible. But there's a few examples in practice. There's some ticketing streamlining, which I think Stephen and I as researchers welcome, because we were trying to make sense of the different array of ticket types that we came across from responses. That took a little bit of time, but more generally, and flippancy aside, working hard to make it easy. If you're confronted at the desk with lots of different ticket types, that can be complicated for visitors. There's some innovation around family tickets emerging. No charge with a paying adult, flat fees, that kind of thing. In terms of online ticketing, it's a bit of a mixed picture. Fewer folk are turning up to buy tickets on the day. Many museums are stopping discounting the pre-booking of tickets because it's such a big proportion of the overall visitor numbers. So that's a bit of a moving feast, but really we're beyond the point where museums feel they have to discount online ticketing, because for many people these visits are pre-planned, thought through, and it's just the new normal. There's some examples of discounting for local audiences. So it can be around postcodes. For example, the Civil War Museum in Newark have taken an approach that provides a free entry for local residents. But other museums, such as the Charles Dickens Museum, working with community partners, giving out free tickets to folk, community groups, housing associations, that kind of thing. And you've also got free days and free months. And others are thinking about deepening their relationship with visitors, so upgrading an annual pass to a more in-depth membership kind of model. Okay, thanks, Stephen. So what's good practice around admissions charging? Good practice, firstly, is keep your pricing strategy under review. Do it annually. Managing expectations of all involved, avoiding big jumps. If you defer and avoid this for 2 or 3 years, all of a sudden you have to make quite a significant jump, and that is firstly something that your colleagues will find difficult to perhaps sell at the front desk, but also if you're in that process of regularly reviewing, even if you perhaps don't 1 year put change prices, it's good practice. Many museums highlight the benefit of if you're going to significantly raise your price, do so with new developments. If something new gallery, new exhibition, some capital redevelopment, that kind of thing is always a good time to change your price strategy. But make sure as much as you can you avoid the scope for difficult conversations at the desk. It's stressful for the visitor, it's stressful for the front of house team. So any way that you can signal changes in advance, communicate them, really important. Donations, if they're an important part of your pricing strategy, be clear and coordinated. Pay what you feel works really well as a donation strategy. For some, it manages those expectations that a donation is expected. And we found that free and price reduction worked really well for some museums to encourage that post-COVID return. Thanks, Stephen. Okay, the importance of business planning and review. We hinted about it earlier, but really pricing should not be considered on its own, not in isolation. It's got to be part of your business planning process. It's good practice to review every year, as we said. Price increases need to be part of an overall business planning strategy and budgeting. Now, benchmarking is used loads through the survey. Really, really encouraging. It helps to give boards or other decision makers confidence in the robustness of a decision to change pricing strategy. But it's always really important to look at the relevance of comparators, their offer, their circumstances, their key characteristics. Are those comparisons reasonable? Are they meaningful? So just a little bit of advice to be thoughtful about benchmarking. I'm sure you all are. Thanks, Stephen. Communication is vital. Can't stress this strongly enough. Explain charging decisions. Be clear about why any changes in pricing have occurred. Listen to your front of house team. It's going back to that issue of avoiding difficult conversations. Listen to your audiences. Do you collect information about the value of your offer in visitor surveys to inform future decisions? We were surprised that the level of data collection we saw that people reported to us wasn't perhaps what we would have expected. If donations are part of an important part of your strategy, be clear and coordinated. Make it easy. Don't make it difficult for people to donate. Think about where your donation points are and the mode and method in which you're using. Everyone in a museum, from the boardroom to the front of house, paid or volunteers, should understand the rationale for any changes in charging. So it's trying to address any nervousness or issues of confidence around that through conversation, through training, and through being very, very clear why it's important to change your approach to pricing. Thanks, Stephen. So some lessons. Don't do it in isolation. Pricing needs to be part of business planning, informed by your values. Engage your board, your stakeholders, staff and volunteers, and make sure they understand the rationale for any changes. Benchmarking, look at the offer of relevant others. Is it comparable? Be confident. Do not be afraid to change. Don't undersell. We don't need to give it away. There's a couple of quotes there from some of our case studies. Manage expectations around concessions. Museums are changing their approach to concessions. Many are moving away from particularly senior concessions and streamlining it. So try and make those communications up front so there's not a difficult conversation at the desk. And be strategic about donations. Pay what you think, communications, donation point locations, going cashless, that sort of thing.